Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a video that is all about my tips for reading classics. I am frequently asked on a lot of my videos what my tips are for tackling long classics, for just getting into classics, period, for coming back to classics that you haven't gotten into since you were in school. And so these are kind of the tips that I have, because I certainly had a period in my life where I was not reading any classics at all. And that, especially for me, was kind of coming out of undergrad, where I did my English minor. And once I got out of undergrad, I really just had no interest in reading anything that qualified to me as work or was going to feel like something that was going to take a lot out of me. Once you've been reading for school, you really just want to start reading for pleasure. And often school has turned us on classics a little bit. And so these are my tips for getting into classics, my tips for reading classics. Classics of all different eras have kind of a level of intimidation, I think, for a lot of people, especially when you haven't read a classic in a long time. I think there is the impulse to say that it's going to feel like work if you read a classic, or you're not going to enjoy it. You're just going to feel like you're back in school and that you're having to do something. It's not something you want to do, it's something you have to do. And that's not true. There are so many wonderful classics out there. And the majority of my favorite classics here in my later life have been those that I did not study in school, and have for the most part been classics that don't tend to have very large name recognition. So there are a lot of really hidden gems out there. I think something that really holds people back from wanting to read classics is the sense that they need to read something, or that there are certain books that you should have read in your life in order to be considered a well-read person. And that actually was kind of my impetus for getting back into classics, because I realized that in my time in high school and college, there were so many big names that I never once tackled in school, and they were books that I felt like I should have read. And so actually that was kind of inspiring to me, but I think that idea is somewhat pretentious, and I think it also puts a level of pressure on reading classics. Like, if I don't enjoy this, then I'm not educated enough, or I'm not intelligent enough. And that is certainly something that I think classics readers kind of promote, is you didn't read this right if you didn't like it. And so my first tip to you is to DNF at will. Drop it. If you don't like it, DNF it. I don't care if it is Romeo and Juliet. I don't care if it is the Odyssey. I don't care if it is Great Expectations. I think when there is that little voice in the back of your head saying, I should have read this, I think there is another little voice that kind of says, this is a great work, and so I should enjoy it. And if I don't enjoy it, what does that make me? No book is for everybody, and that includes some of the so-called greats. There are plenty of books that are really huge, massive classics that I genuinely don't enjoy. War and Peace, I didn't enjoy it. I think DNFing will also allow you to avoid getting into a reading slump. Don't ever feel like you need to force yourself to read something. I felt like this when I first got into classics, that I shouldn't DNF, and that I should really try to see something through, if only to understand why it had maintained popularity. And I think that honestly sent me into quite a few reading slumps, and I don't want that for anybody. It's not that important. And again, no book is for everybody. You genuinely may not like how some of the greatest authors of all time write. You may not like their style, and that's totally valid. So my first tip to you is DNF at will. My second tip goes hand in hand with that, and it is to read something that you are genuinely excited about. I think that seems like such an obvious tip, but when we're talking about classics, I think we kind of get into our heads that list of the Western canon, and we start thinking, well, maybe I've never read the Iliad and I should definitely read that, or I should read Ovid's Metamorphoses. And that may not be your cup of tea. That may not be a book that you are generally interested in. And so when you are just starting your journey with classics, it really helps you to do everything you can to set yourself up for success. And so to me, picking a book that you are really interested in can help you, a book that you're excited about. And this may even go into, say, picking a book from a genre that you know you already enjoy. For example, in the Victorian period, they were writing in all of the modern genres that we have. So if you're a literary fiction person, you may want to go to somebody like George Eliot. If you are a historical fiction person, you may want to look up something like Lorna Doone. And so that will also, I think, set you up for success because it is a genre that you are familiar with in the modern day. You know the tropes of, you know how people tend to write it. And I think that can be exciting when you see something that was maybe an originator of a genre that we have today. But I think that's kind of the best beginner tip, is just go into something knowing that you're free to not enjoy it. I think there is just such a level of intimidation with classics because we do feel like a book that has lasted this long, there has to be some merit in. And I think a lot of people too were just burned in school. They had poor teachers or they read the wrong things. And that really sets people up for failure with classics. And it really actually makes people have a very poor relationship with them. And I think if you go into reading a classic with the mindset that this doesn't have to be your new all-time favorite book, you can put it down, or you know that it's a book that you have been really excited about, I think you are going to go into it with a better attitude and maybe also with more success. In terms of being intimidated by classics, I think length is another factor. A lot of people have this idea that classics are really long, like War and Peace comes to mind, Anna Karenina, the Brothers Karamazov, things that are really, really long come to mind. And a lot of modern books are just no longer that length, or if they are, they're not written in this denser language. I think you can tackle a classic of any length by interspersing other reads with it. And I think this is particularly true of books that are long. Some of my favorite classics are the ones that are 1,000-page long beasts, like The Count of Monte Cristo. But The Count of Monte Cristo was such a success for me as a reader because I did not read it straight through. I never allowed myself to get bogged down in it. And so I was always interspersing modern fiction with it. I was always reading other things, and I never made myself feel like I had to be reading that. I had to finish that. And I think that made the reading experience so much more enjoyable for me. I think if length is part of what majorly intimidates you, this is a tip that I don't know is true for everybody else, but it's definitely true for me. I now really like to read classics on my Kindle, particularly long classics, because I feel like there's just a psychological component to me. I feel like I read faster on my Kindle or online, and I feel like the book isn't as long when it's on Kindle. I think when you are staring down a brick of a physical book, then you do feel a sense of dread, or you think, oh, I'm never going to be able to finish this. When I'm reading on Kindle, the length is very rarely a factor in my enjoyment because I'm not seeing the physical book. I also have it set up so it doesn't really tell me how long I have left in the book too. So that's kind of like a psychological trick. And I don't know if everyone else feels the same way, but I certainly feel as though I am a faster reader when I am reading on my Kindle or I am reading online. And I don't know if that's true, but that's always been how I felt. And so one of my tips to you is if you are intimidated by the length of a book, I say try to download it on Kindle or on your phone and give it a read that way and see if the length bothers you there. And most classics have a free Kindle version or a free ebook version on Project Gutenberg. The Kindle is also just in general the cheaper way to go with classics because of that. And so that's kind of why I have started reading more classics on my Kindle, but I certainly feel like books just aren't as long when I'm reading them on my Kindle. And so that's one of my tips for you. But there are also plenty of short classics out there that you can read as well, and length is most certainly not a factor there. I personally tend to be kind of prejudiced against shorter reads, and I tend to really like a book that's a lot longer. I feel like it takes a lot for me to enjoy something that was very short, like a novella or a short novel. But there are plenty of short classics that I think are ideal for getting you into classics in general. Things like A Room with a View, or even something like a Shakespeare play, which might be intimidating because of its language, but not because of its length. I think there are plenty of short classics out there that could get you started. And there are so many that were written by very famous classic authors. So somebody like Alexander Dumas, who wrote The Count of Monte Cristo, The Three Musketeers, he also has short fiction, like he has a version of The Nutcracker. He has plays. Charles Dickens very famously has things like A Christmas Carol that you can read to see if you like an author's style before you decide to commit to that 1,000-page long beast. And the Russian authors are ideal for this. A lot of them wrote short fiction, and a lot of them wrote 1,000-page epics. And I personally have really enjoyed using short fiction as the stepping stone into their longer work, because it tells me kind of off the bat, if I like how you write in short fiction, I am more willing to try something that is very long from you because I know I already enjoy your writing style. I'm planning a video right now that is all about short classics, and so when that is done, maybe I will link it below. I feel like we talked about the main levels of intimidation with classics, the feeling that you should read something and you should have read it a long time ago and that you should enjoy it. I feel like that is all one factor. But then also the factor of length we've covered. The last factor of intimidation with classics that I want to cover today is the content of the classic. I think people believe that the language of a classic novel is going to be very dense and difficult to understand. And not just that, but that the plots are a little bit more convoluted because in a lot of these longer novels, you're following a really massive cast of characters that you're trying to keep straight. So I think the content of a classic can also intimidate a reader. And so I have a couple of tips for this. One of these is, I think, a very controversial tip in the classics community, and that is I say watch an adaptation of it. This is how I largely got my start in classics reading, is I watched adaptations of books before I read them. And I personally see nothing wrong with that. There are a lot of people who really dislike it because I think they believe that's robbing the book of some of its mystery, or you're not really getting the most out of the book by having elements of the plot spoiled for you. But a really great adaptation will help you because then you will already know the big beats of the story. No adaptation can cover a book in its entirety, so there's always going to be something new to discover when you read the classic itself. I have a lot of absolutely favorite adaptations. I love the 2016 BBC War and Peace. I say that as somebody who really struggled with the book and actually DNF'd it. But every time I think of that miniseries, I want to read the book. And it actually made the book more digestible to me because I knew in broad strokes who the main characters were. Jane Austen has some incredible adaptations out there. The 2020 Emma I watched before reading the book Emma, and I think it aided me. This, I think, is something that comes down to personal preference. And if you really want to go into a book blind, you really want to just experience the book on its own, then maybe don't watch an adaptation of it. But if you are struggling with a book, if you get about halfway through a book and you're really struggling with it, like say Vanity Fair, this happened for me. I sat down and watched the Vanity Fair adaptation from a couple of years ago with Olivia Cooke. It helped. I think watching the adaptation can be something you do before picking up the book, but it can also be a tool you use while reading. Maybe you reach a certain point and you know the first episode of an adaptation has been covered, and you watch that to maybe get a frame of reference to be able to picture the characters. I personally think watching an adaptation is a great tip, but it's something that I've done. Again, I think this comes down to personal preference. Some people really don't want to read a book after it's been spoiled for them. But I think it's really helpful to have a background of the plot and also of the characters and actually be able to picture people as the characters. Something else that will help you with this, I think, is listening to an audiobook. This also apparently is a pretty controversial tip because there's so much argument here on BookTube, online, and bookish spaces about whether listening to audiobooks is actually reading. And it is actually reading. I don't know who told you it wasn't, but it is actually reading. I am just not generally an audiobook person, but I know a lot of people that reading the audiobook of a long classic like Bleak House, like War and Peace, that's been the only way they could tackle it and finish it. And in fact, earlier this year, I listened to Don Quixote on audiobook and I thoroughly enjoyed the experience. I think this is ideal for a long classic because it also doesn't let you feel the length of the book to me when you are listening to it on audiobook. But I think it is also a good tool for a book that you feel is pretty dense or convoluted. There are a lot of really great classic audiobooks that have full casts in terms of narrators, and so you're not really confused about who's speaking when. I think these are really great tools and aids when you are intimidated by a particular classic book. And one of my favorite tricks, something that I do pretty frequently when I do listen to an audiobook, I read the text alongside listening to the audiobook. And that just kind of reinforces things to me, and it actually means that I remember things a little bit better. I feel like it locks things into my long-term memory better when I am both listening and reading on the page. So that's something that I do, and I love to do it with books that I feel are pretty dense classics. Last but not least, I want to encourage you to read translated classics. I think telling a beginner to read a translated classic feels like an oxymoron and it feels like something that you shouldn't do. But in my experience, translated classics have more updated language than classics that were written in your native language. So I tend to find that translated classics, say from Italian or Russian, they read a little bit more modern to me than books that were written at the same time in English. And it's because a modern translator, 9 times out of 10, has been working on this translation. And so they have incorporated kind of a plainer language a lot of the time. There's good and bad in this because I think you then feel as though you have lost something in translation, and most certainly you have. But I think it is a great tool for the beginner to classics because it means that you're not dealing with the more complicated language that I think most people associate with classics. And so I really recommend reading something that has been translated from Russian, translated from French. The Count of Monte Cristo was one of the first classics that I read when I was getting back into classics, and the language was never what bothered me about it. The language was very, very easy to read. And it actually, in the end, I think helped me on the whole because since the language wasn't that hard, I didn't feel as though the book was that long, even though objectively the book is like 1,500 pages. There are also plenty of short translated classics. So this is something that I think people are also kind of worried about, is reading a book that is in translation. And you really don't need to be. I find things like that tend to be easier to read. Even things that are like ancient classics. Well, they've been more recently translated. So to me, they don't feel as archaic in language as even sometimes Charles Dickens feels to me. So I just really want to encourage people to read more translated classics because they bring me a lot of joy. But I also think people think that can't be your first step. You need to build up to a translated classic, and you don't. There are really no rules at all in terms of reading, but particularly in terms of reading classics. So do what you want to do and do what you feel comfortable doing. But these are tips that I feel like worked for me when I was getting back into reading classics, and I just wanted to share them today. I would love to know down below if you have used these tips, and I would love to know what your tips are for getting into classics. But that's all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.